for being here with us on this Wednesday evening / afternoon, night, depending on where you are. I have a great panel of people, and I will speak as little as possible because they have much more interesting things to say. So I would like, we were talking right beforehand, and I think one thing that came out a lot in a lot of the conversations was the fiscal side. And I would like to ask Alberto Ramos to kind of kick us off with this overview, with an overview of what's been happening in Brazil, where we are, and a little bit of what's important on that fiscal side that's been key to Brazil investments for years and years, and now we're in a bit of a different position.
Well, thank you, Julia. Good afternoon, good day to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to share a panel with such, distinguished set of speakers. I mean, what's happening in Brazil is not a particular novelty. It's no different than what many other economies are facing at this stage. It's a global recession, deterioration of the terms of trade through the decline in commodity prices, and now the enemy is within. We also have a viral outbreak that requires the adoption of social distancing protocols, measures to restrict movement and activity. So the bottom line, we expect a very severe contraction of activity. Our own numbers at this stage is a contraction between 7.5% to 8%. There is a fair amount of uncertainty, actually more than a fair amount, significant uncertainty, because a lot depends on the viral path and for how long we need these measures in place to restrict activity and movement as a way, as a segue to control the viral pandemic. So more than what's happening from the real business cycle perspective, a very severe contraction of activity, it's important to look at the policy backdrop, and that, the fiscal discussion is a key one. Brazil is facing the pandemic from a position of fiscal fragility, and also where the business cycle has been somewhat disappointing in terms of the recovery. We saw a very significant contraction of activity during the 2014-15 crisis, and after that, a rather anemic recovery, like really a slow recovery, to the point that before the pandemic, the unemployment rate was still in double digits, the output gap was still considerable, and growth in general are relatively modest. So what are we doing from a policy standpoint? We're doing what everybody else is doing, even though the initial conditions are quite different. From a monetary standpoint, we saw, and we continue to see the central bank cutting rates aggressively and also engaging in all sorts of measures to make sure that liquidity, both in local currency and in dollars, remains relatively abundant. From a fiscal standpoint, and that's the most interesting part of the story, we see the validation of a very large fiscal expansion. Again, keep in mind that in terms of the main macro challenges, we have a public health crisis, we have an economic crisis, we have a social crisis, we also have some political challenges. We have experts in the panel that I'm sure will deal with that. And what is at the core of the fiscal challenges? Let's start with the observation that Brazil has been running primary fiscal deficit for 6 years in a row. This is going to be the seventh, where the public debt, the stock, was at 76% of GDP, quite high in absolute terms, also quite high in terms of the similarly rated peers. And now we have to do what needs to be done. People are literally dying in intensive care units, so we need to validate the fiscal expansion. Part of that is a passive expansion, has to do with the expected decline of activity, and with the decline of activity comes the decline in tax collection, and also probably tax enforcement as well, and tax compliance. So that in itself, if we think about the contraction between 7 and 8, will lead to a very significant widening of the fiscal deficits just through the work of the automatic stabilizers. You collect less revenue, and there are also some automatic pressures on spending on things like unemployment benefits and other things that don't need to be legislated. But on top of that, we need to go beyond that. We need to spend more. And we need to spend more on what? Well, we need to increase the allocations to the public healthcare system, which is under significant pressure. We need to provide some financial relief to the states and municipalities. Many of them were actually broke before the outset of the pandemic, and they are now in the front lines of dealing with the public health crisis. We also need to broaden and deepen the social safety net, because a recession of this magnitude is going to have a very significant impact on the social conditions. And Finally, you also need to provide some type of relief to the business sector, to the corporate sector, so that they are able to navigate the sudden stop of activity to make sure there will be viable businesses, post pandemic. If you don't do that, you run the risk of destroying the capital stock of the economy, impairing the productive capacity of the economy. So those are monies well invested in the protection of the capital stock. By protecting the capital stock, you are investing in the recovery. By investing in the recovery, it's an investment also in the future tax stream. But the problem is that Brazil, ex ante, did not have any fiscal space. I told you that we've been running fiscal deficits for 6 consecutive years, that the public debt is already quite high, and now you're going to validate a very large expansion. So if you add the impact of the automatic stabilizers plus a fiscal package that is still work in progress, the Congress is still legislating additional measures and the extension of the first batch of measures, in our numbers, we'll be ending the year with a primary fiscal deficit between -13 to -15. That means that the overall fiscal deficit is going to be probably between -17 to -19, eventually even -20. That means that the public debt is going to go from 76 to something around 95. The numbers could be worse, of course, depends on the number of things, including the depth of the recession. So that means that if we start with a very fragile fiscal position, you're going to come out of this with an even uglier fiscal position, which requires a lot of discipline and the right signaling from the authorities, from the policymakers, that this is just a one-off experiment, that you're not going to increase permanent entitlement programs, because otherwise the fiscal burden is for today and for the years to come. And after that, you're going to embrace fiscal adjustment, which has a structural component and a cyclical component. And the biggest fear in the market is that when exactly will the authorities embrace such a fiscal adjustment? First, the political dynamics and the policy implementation dynamics has been deteriorating. We have Chris on the panel and Otaviano, other experts on the political environment that will certainly comment on that. But it seems that governability has been deteriorating given this constant environment of significant polarization between the executive and the legislative, the executive and the judiciary, the executive and the press, and the executive against the executive itself, given that we had 2 ministers of health, over the last 6 weeks, departure of a very popular minister of justice, also some friction between the inner circle of the president and the economic team under Paulo Guedes. So it seems that the policy environment is not ideal. So nothing can guarantee that post-pandemic, let's talk 2021, they will actually embrace the adjustments that are needed. And my fear is that when you get to 2021, the economy will still probably be recovering from a very, very deep recession. The damage in the labor market will still be very fresh and very visible. So there will be plenty of demands coming from society and probably echoing in Congress for additional spending. So a good outcome is that we don't adjust, but at least we don't spend more. But that is not guaranteed. So then we move to 2022, which is a presidential election year, actually a general election year, and usually you don't do fiscal adjustments in election years, and we don't know even the outcome of that election. So there are significant concerns of what's going on. We're gonna come with an even more fragile fiscal position, which puts us in a position of vulnerability to all sorts of shocks because we're very close to 100% of GDP. Certainly, Brazil has a very deep local market that allows it to satisfy large fiscal funding needs by placing that domestically, a luxury that, for instance, our neighbors in Argentina, it's inexistent because of the narrowness of the local market. But that's not a free lunch. That has implications for crowding out, as an implication for the allocation of resources of the economy, particularly in an economy with a very low domestic savings rate. And at the same time, we see also a rather aggressive calibration of monetary policy. So you may reach a point where you may eventually, lose a grip on the process. So this is not a narrative that Brazil is bound for an irreversible fiscal crisis, but is a warning signal that we are actually quite vulnerable. So we are developing fiscal comorbidities, if you allow me, the analogy to COVID, and we may actually be over-medicating the patient. We are over-medicating on the fiscal side and perhaps also on the monetary side. We can discuss that at a later point. We may be pushing the envelope too much on the fiscal and too much on the monetary. Let me just allow just to give you my favorite analogy on this fiscal expansion. The countries are facing unavoidable needs for extra fiscal spending. It's actually the way to protect the economy is eventually to spend more. But because not every country has the same fiscal space ex ante, the cost of doing so can be quite different. If you are Peru, you are Chile, plenty of fiscal space, or even Colombia or or Mexico. You can do it. You can validate a large fiscal expansion. That's not going to change that much the day after, the way you calibrate monetary policy and fiscal policy post-pandemic. If you don't have any fiscal space exempted, because of Brazil, actually, you're already running behind in what they should have done from a fiscal standpoint, the price tag could be completely different. So my analogy is the following. Imagine two households, two families now. One very responsible, was managing the family finances in a very responsible way. They had accumulated some savings in the bank, and now they were hit by a negative shock. They crashed the family automobile, and they need to repair it. So you go, you dip from your savings, you repair the automobile. You're poorer, you have less savings, you have less of a cushion, but it doesn't change the way the family has been living just because of that. Lower savings, you might, start to incrementally save a little bit more in the years to come, but, life goes on the same. Now imagine a second family that has not been as fiscally responsible or responsibly managing the household finances, and they were already deep in debt in the credit card. You can imagine that I'm talking about Brazil right now, very high level of debt. And they had the same shock. They crashed the family automobile, and you needed to drive the kids to school and whatnot. You need to repair it. That means that you're going to go deeper into that. And there are potential consequences of doing that. One could be that the credit card officer reviews your profile and said, you know what, with that type of debt, I think you are now a riskier profile. I'm going to increase the interest rate on credit card debt to you. Or they may actually cut you off. So that's not necessarily, again, a narrative that Brazil will experience a fiscal crisis, but it is a warning that these fiscal vulnerabilities require immediately, the sooner the better, some policy signal from the authorities, from Congress, from the executive, on finally embracing the structural fiscal reforms that have been pending. We already lost too much time in moving the fiscal needle. I think we need to speed it up right now. Let me stop here.
Thank you. Lisa, how are you seeing the reforms? Are we going to have reforms after this is over? How are you seeing this fiscal path ahead?
Thanks a lot, Julia, and it's a pleasure to be here on the panel. Thank you, Sue Ali, for the invitation. And it's always a pleasure to be on your panels, and this is just one of the, in particular, an incredible group of colleagues. If you look at, speaking from the rating perspective, I think the question of, will you pick up the reform momentum that we had seen earlier in the Bolsonaro administration is the key question. Stepping back, in December of last year, we put a positive outlook on Brazil's BB- rating, because following the passage of a pension reform that came delayed number of years after the putting in place of the spending cap, we felt that the broad agenda of the Bolsonaro administration, the economic team, Guedes, Campos Neto, other members in the administration, that broad macro and micro agenda in terms of opening the economy, privatizations, concessions with an eye of greater degree of productivity, tackling aspects in the fiscal accounts, which are a key weakness bit by bit. So we're trying to work with the states and the local governments, et cetera. A very broad agenda, the BC hashtag agenda. And we felt that there was momentum as talk of tax reform, administrative reform, et cetera. Could this kick in, this chance it could kick in for a positive cycle to help ameliorate the key rating weaknesses, which are the fiscal story and growth, which have already taken real hits and are at the very low end from our criteria perspective of weighing on the rating. We saw this chance. However, if you read our outlook statement as well, we noted that we could revert to stable if, for whatever reason, there were economic developments that undermined passage and implementation of corrective structural reforms over the next 2 years that could weigh on the prospects for this upward momentum. And the COVID pandemic actually did that. So we revised the outlook to stable at the beginning of April. And so the key issue for us moving forward is, can you pick up this momentum? And that remains an open question. Well, I'm sure that Ottaviano and Chris will get back to that, but that's one of the things we'll be looking for. Where we're looking today, yes, the fiscal is going to take a big hit. We have sequentially lowered our growth outlook. And there's downside risk from where we are as our economic team is updating it. We're at almost 5% contraction this year. Signs are could be more. And clearly the fiscal story is going to weaken that much more. We were assuming some improvement, still from a very weak base, as Alberto highlighted, but we were assuming turnaround. We still didn't have a primary surplus in our projections over the forecast horizon of the next couple of years, but you were seeing a downtick in very high deficit levels. Clearly, we have the deficit moving up to the order of magnitude that Alberto highlighted. The government is on the same page with that in terms of a significant primary deficit and a rise in debt, et cetera. But that is a key weakness already in the rating. I want to point that out there. Brazil moved from BBB to BB minus over a number of years because of deterioration in the fiscal story and in the growth story, which is below that of peers with a similar level of economic development. And we don't expect the recovery to be dramatic in Brazil, LATAM in general, but Brazil as well. And that's where the crucial issue of can you recover some of this momentum comes into play. The rating, however, is already hit by these two key weaknesses. What holds up the rating, from our point of view, is strength in the external position and strength in the monetary policy framework. And the external position, yes, there have been outflows, particularly on the portfolio equity and debt side, with some pressure on international reserves, pressure on the real. But as the real's flowing, there's some adjustment going on, and we still see strength in our external position, which we actually have forecast somewhat conservatively. So we expect this to still be a strength. Were that to weaken in a more meaningful way, whether it's contaminated by slowness in tackling the fiscal, that's something that could weigh on the rating for downside pressure. Similarly, on the monetary policy front, I think you've actually seen significant credibility built up over the recent years. Temer, Goldfein, now Campos Neto, the extension of a broad agenda at Banco Central. And I think that what you've seen in terms of interventions, in terms of providing liquidity on the FX side, you've seen Brazil do this in the past in different ways. It did very adeptly in 2008, 2009, the way it deployed FX reserves. And in our base case, that will be the remain, right? So in contrast to what Alberto highlighted, I think we see key strength here, and all signaling from the authorities is that, you know, they're stepping in not to change the direction of the real, but to tackle volatility. The same thing, provide liquidity, not deal with the solvency issue. I think what we saw under the Dilma administration post the global financial crisis is many of the measures stayed too long. So that goes back to what will be the corrective measures at that point, deploying Band-Aid, quasi-fiscal, et cetera. What will be the policy stance after the pandemic? And I think you've already seen some signaling coming from certainly the economic team with the signaling they put out, with the way they've dialogued in general throughout this, the goal of keeping this temporary. I think what we've seen Congress to date, yes, there's noise and some potential backsliding and maybe more stimulus than the economic team may want, but you still see a concept from at least from our point of view thus far in terms of keeping things temporary from the Congress side, and that's certainly the message from the economic team. And the agenda and the comments from Minister Guedes last week in terms of, you know, cooperation, collaboration, understanding and solidarity post-pandemic, and the agenda they highlighted is wanting to keep all of these things on the table post-pandemic. That's the key, and so I don't think you're seeing slippage there now, but it's a question of can you move that forward after the fact, and that's where the broader political picture comes in. You know, again, we did take the positive outlook off because we see the risks more evenly balanced that you won't progress. Rodrigo Maia stepping down next year. He's played an important role in strengthening the role of the legislative branch to step in and help lead on the reform agenda. Who will come after him, and will they pick up that baton in the dynamism that you've seen in dialoguing with the president, with the economic team, with the governors, et cetera, for example, to improve an outcome in Congress in the sense of the government putting forth a veto last week on key measures in the package of aid for state and local governments. So I think this is where you see a mix here, but there's a key institutional strength here in Brazil, despite the noise. And I think that's where I would want to kind of finish up. We've hit the rating already in our last downgrade in 2018 for the slowness in the policy response to tackle the structural fiscal issues. If you look at what we think, could it get worse? I mean, given the parameters of the way we talk about the conflict or a lack of predictability in policymaking, that's not our base case at the moment, because there are important institutional strengths and mechanisms. Yes, there's a lot of noise, but we had a lot of noise around Dilma and the impeachment, and when the first sitting senator was arrested, and issues of back and forth under the Temer administration and Lava Jato investigations there, stymieing progress on pension reform. So yes, a lot of noise, but in terms of outcomes, that's what we're going to be looking for. Yes, additional fiscal slippage, but they're still signaling that they want to get some of that back moving forward. That's the thing that we'll be looking at moving forward to strengthen growth in fiscal post-pandemic.
So I wanted to talk to Ottaviano now. I think, Ottaviano, you were saying that the quality of the response of the government to this crisis will determine the final outcome, which is what Lisa was also saying. So can you tell us a little bit about how are you seeing this response so far?
Yes, look, the Brazilian performance when it comes to the coronavirus has been subpar in the sense that we're still watching the rise along the pandemic curve. Deaths per million inhabitants. Now Brazil is the 6th position, but the number of deaths daily on a daily basis has been going up. And we all know that ultimately there's no major trade-off between economic activity and the outbreaks of the coronavirus. So if this takes too long to go beyond the peak, we might have, let's say, a downfall on the GDP side that may be worse than the ones that have been suggested by Alberto and others. So, and using exactly the nice presentations that both Lisa and Alberto said, I would say that this will intertwine with the following. Yes, this year, Brazil is going to have the public debt and the primary debts going to record levels of high. But frankly, all signals point to Mansueto, the Treasury, not having major difficulties to live through 2020, in the sense that there is monetary conditions are favorable, there is a scope for obtaining finance of this increased financial needs from the government. But everything from next year on, or for after the coronavirus, will hinge on which trajectory the government takes on with respect to the path of fiscal. Alberto is right. The figures are humongous, are scary, but one may presume that, provided that the economy grows something close to its potential growth rate, currently estimating it as 2% or 2.2%. If the spending cap is returned, even if the public debt trajectory will take place at a less favorable path than it would be the case without coronavirus, it's still conceivable that the evolution of the public debt to GDP might reach a peak before the end of next decade, and we might have, let's say, an evolution along which there will be no fiscal space, but there will remain monetary policy space to keep interest rates low and so on. And then everything will depend on whether, without fiscal space, the government managed to implement the structural reform agenda that would open space and interest from private investors to come to infrastructure. Water sanitation is the obvious case. There is a bill, a Reading project, to be voted in the next 3 weeks, according to the Speaker House and the House Speaker. And the fact of the matter is that even if this year is awful in terms of the evolution of the fiscal and public debt, there is ground to believe that it's possible not to have a catastrophe from next year onwards. If whatever be the government, probably the current government, remains with the announcement of going back to the spending cap and the fiscal framework that was in place before, if it abandons that and starts with any sort of adventure trying to increase growth through fiscal expansion, then I see the problem. Then the whole structure, the whole building would become unsustainable, and we would start watching capital outflows, and we would have a trajectory like the Argentinian one in place. So it's kind of a crossroad, and that's where I believe the channel through which the politics may influence not only the adoption of a path, but also the evaluation by investors from outside. It's not political noise, I would say, unless Chris corrects me. It's not that investors start looking at the news. What they're mainly concerned with is whether the politics will lead or not the Brazilian policymaking towards the unsustainable, the devil's path. Because the other one exists. There is a possible reasonably favorable scenario, even with the increase of the public debt to GDP to something close to 100% at the end of this year. It will hinge on which path. Either stick with the promise of going back to the previous framework and going, let's say, more diligently with the agenda of structural reforms to open space for private investments in infrastructure, or in adoption of some populistic, that would be the disaster. That's what everyone is looking at, both domestically and externally as well.
Chris, I'll send it to you to talk about all the political noise.
Yeah, no, thank you. First and foremost, it's just a tremendous pleasure to be able to be on this panel. Thank you, Swidley, for the invitation. It's great to participate in such a high quality debate with such distinguished colleagues. Let me pick up on the kind of the last comments here of Ottaviano and kind of, reference to a critical juncture, and kind of crosswords. And I'll make the case, just to begin with my opening remarks, that we have a very critical political and fiscal window ahead of us, which I would say is probably from September to December of this year. And why do I say that? Because on the political side, evidently, the combination of a highly contentious strategy of managing COVID-19 from the president, ongoing investigations against the president's inner circle that led to the exit of Minister of Sergio Moro, high-profile tensions with the courts has put the president's mandate at risk. Right now, what we're hearing from Congress, and we've been kind of speaking with party leaders on a regular basis in the lower house and the Senate, very intense kind of virtual sessions with politicians in Brasilia. And what everyone is saying is that there is no appetite to impeach or remove the president in the middle of a pandemic. And it's hard for you to be able to remove a president when the economy is recovering. So the window of vulnerability from a political point of view is after the pandemic and before an economic recovery. That's the window where he's vulnerable for an acute political crisis that could lead to his exit, probably between September and March of next year, something like that. And then when it comes to the fiscal debate, we have two very important fiscal debates. The first is going to be, we have a program of relief to families, companies, and workers that was designed on a 3-month lockdown. Looking at the pandemic itself, it looks as if that, we're not close to a bending of the curve. We're having a very challenging next couple months ahead. Governors and mayors are having a lot of pressure to ease the lockdown, but they're going to keep an eye on the spare capacity of ICU beds in the hospitals, how close you are to a collapse of public health systems. They will extend lockdowns if you get close to a collapse, deepen, go back. So we're in a kind of a stop and go mode on the public health side. So we'll have a debate to be able to expand the benefits that were granted for a 3-month lockdown, probably. Economic team will try to keep it, that number low. To the extent it's one-off for 2020, okay. But the more difficult debate will be in September to November of this year, which is what to do with 2021. Because if we're sitting in September and October, and we have a headline GDP contraction, if Alberto is correct, and we're headed towards contraction of -7, -8, the political debate will be, we need to extend the period of exemptionality for spending outside the cap on spending in 2020 to 2021. And then there will be an argument that we need to be able to either spend more on health, spend more on investments, spend more on social assistance to dig ourselves out of a recession. The risk is, exactly what Taviano said, if you create an exemption for next year, markets will say we're in a slippery slope and there's no end in sight, and the fiscal anchor goes away, and you're in a currency crisis and a fiscal crisis of confidence mode. So ultimately, that window will be critical to set the parameters for the second half of the mandate, where we are from a political point of view, where we are from a fiscal point of view. What's our bet? I think that, our bet at Eurasia Group and what I've been defending is we're probably going to see an environment where the president will come out of COVID-19 more weakened. I think that his approval ratings will probably drop further. He will pay somewhat of a cost for the public health crisis that we're going to see over the next month or two. Investigations against the president are going to continue. The specter of impeachment will remain over the president's head, but I don't think the president will lose his mandate. Because you look at from a public opinion point of view, what we're really seeing is a deepening of the polarization trend. The president's approval ratings on a binary scale, he's anywhere polling from 35 to 40% support on the binary scale. If you have a 5-point scale, excellent, good, regular, bad, horrible, his excellent good numbers drop from 30 to 36 to 25 to 32. So about 5-point drop on his base. I don't see his base abandoning him because of investigations against the family, what the video says, fake news. No, that's not going to impact his base. The real risk is, are we going to have a public health calamity and a collapse of public health systems over the next 2 months, of which the blame will fall in the president's lap? If you have a dramatic drop in support, then the president's mandate is at risk. I put that odds at around 1 in 4. I don't think it'll happen because of the loyalty of the polarized politics in Brazil, but the risk is there, right? I do think the president will come out weakened, and we're going to see a deepening of polarization of politics in terms of a hardening of the president's base of support, a hardening of those who are opposed to him, probably, mobilizations for and against, chronic institutional tensions with the Supreme Court. But why don't I think that the fiscal framework is likely to break along the lines of the concerns that have just been outlined here? Because the one thing that we have in this environment is, look at what the environment is in Congress today. And what's really interesting is, in all of the conversations that we at Eurasia Group have been having with party leaders in the Senate and the lower house, almost every single conversation I've had over the past month reveals that party leaders are afraid of an unhinged fiscal crisis of confidence. And this is a political leadership that has been molded by the last crisis. This has been molded by the 2015, 2016 economic crunch that led to the downfall of Dilma Rousseff. And for better or worse, we've had 4 years of debate that you've made the link between a fiscal crisis on the one hand with an economic crisis of confidence on the other. That link was hammered over and over again. It led to the Congress approving the constitutional cap on spending in 2016. It led to Congress approving pension reform last year. Legislators are worried about a fiscal crisis. These aren't legislators, these aren't Chicago-trained economists. This isn't the German parliament. I'm not saying that that's the case, but they are worried about simply lifting the cap on spending, because then we can get back to an unhinged crisis where everybody loses, okay? So what that means to me is that if there is pressure for larger one-off spend this year or potentially next year, I think that there is room for a grand bargain. And the grand bargain in Congress is, if we have a larger one-off spend, taking the debt to GDP to 95, 100% of GDP, that in exchange for a larger one-off spend, depending upon the size of the crunch, that some version of a fiscal reform or administrative reform to control future spending obligations can be given as a counterparty measure to avoid financial markets from viewing this as a slippery slope that doesn't have an end. And I think it's a good thing that Rodrigo Maia will be in his post until February next year, because that grand bargain has to be struck second half of the year. Any grand bargain about the constitutional cap on spending next year has to be approved in Congress before the end of this year. So I think that the president embattled, fighting for his life, a deeply polarized environment, will compromise the quality of that grand bargain. But I still think a grand bargain is to be had, and ultimately is this political leadership of an unhinged fiscal crisis that I think puts some guardrails. Yes, Rodrigo Maia stepping down, it may reduce some of the reform impetus in 2021. I still think next year tax reform will be on the table, even without Rodrigo Maia. There's a lot of support towards that. I think it'll be the character tax reform will change, not just simplification. I think some sectors will pay the price. The politics of the recession will rear their ugly head. And there are two big targets right now in Congress, the wealthy and banks. So I think we're probably going to get a higher tax burden to each of those in some version of a tax reform. It's not going to be as clean as the reformist agenda. We'll still get some mild progress on sanitation reform, central bank autonomy, but then we're going to have all the politics of protecting consumers, trying to be able to target certain segments to be able to fund a different program. So the quality of the reform agenda next year will diminish, absolutely, and we're kind of a bad muddle through to 2022, right? But my only point here, just to be able to imprint, is the reason why we're not betting on an unhinged fiscal crisis is let's not underappreciate the lessons that the political class took out of the last crisis. And ultimately, I think it was a constructive lesson. So let me end here, and then we can dig deeper on Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I want to pick up on something that you said that we haven't talked about much. I think Lisa mentioned the BRL a little bit, but I wanted to ask, Alberto Bernal, how are markets in all this, right? We've seen markets slide, and now in the past week or so, everything is rebounding, right? Even as things are still in flow, Brazil's recording records almost every day. So how are our financial markets seeing Brazil right now?
Yeah, sure. Well, hi, Julia. Thank you for the question. Sueli, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be in your panels. Lisa, it's great to see you for the third time this month. And to all of the rest of the panelists, it's a pleasure to be with you guys. That's, Julia, a very good friend of mine. He's a long-term trader, and he's been trading the real for a very long time. And he has a saying that I love, and he keeps on saying, I tell him, Alberto, what is the most dangerous thing other than being long the BRL? And I keep on saying, what? He says, well, being short the BRL. And that's exactly what the latest performance has been showing us. For those of you that haven't seen what the BRL did in the last couple of weeks, it's gone from, we were talking about the 6 handle in a couple of days. We're down to 505 last I checked before I came into this room. So it's amazing how this currency moves and how you can make a fortune or how you can lose a fortune in a couple of minutes. That's the reality. Another piece of information that I've been very impressed, and I haven't seen the final numbers on that, but before I came in as well, what I had been hearing from my salespeople in the bank is that the offering of the bonds that were sold today by Brazil in New York had been 13 times oversubscribed. 13 times. And it's like, what? What are you talking about? Because Alberto's right. This country is going to run a 20% deficit this year, probably. So it's incredible that we're seeing this amazing performance of assets, while at the same time, the situation on the real economy continues to look so dire. But that's not only a Brazil thing, Julia. It's an everywhere place thing. It's the same thing in the United States. We're close to being flat on the year, and we're down 40 million people in terms of employment. So what's going on? And that's why I want to take 2 minutes before I go into the other issue that I wanted to mention, because Chris mentioned what I think is the most important issue, which is when are we going to find a peak in cases in Brazil? I think that's a very key question, and I think that I can provide some guidance on that. Not me, my team in Sao Paulo, who did all the econometrics on this thing. What is it that is going on? Why is it that we're seeing this issue? And let me start by saying that perhaps the most important issue, obviously, is the Fed being able or having announced that they're going to buy high yield bonds. To me, that is the most relevant announcement from a central bank since I became an economist. The Central Bank of the United States buying high yield bonds is a very big deal. Even if you don't buy any junk bonds, just saying that you're going to buy some changes everything completely, because it takes away the risk that we're going to see a Lehman Brothers type of situation. If you have that risk off the table, that you're not going to see a Lehman type of situation, and you have to co-live with $18 trillion in government bonds yielding negative, or 16 or 18 trillion dollars and yielding negative yields in the market, then you get countries like Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, etc., which are having a very hard time coming to the market, and you're gonna buy those bonds. Why? Because it makes sense. There's too much money flowing around, and from the standpoint of you as an asset manager that needs to yet generate something for your clients, you have to take a bet on these assets that will give you at least some yield. And of course, hope for the best. But to me, that cannot be the only part of the story. And to me, the biggest part of the story, which has been completely missed by most everybody, politicians, the press, many economists, etc. To me, the most relevant piece of information that I have seen since the pandemic started is the following. According to the CDC version of the state of New York, 43% of the Bronx already had COVID-19. When I saw that, I was like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? It's like 43% of the borough of the Bronx in New York City already had the virus. I was like, well, that's a lot of people. So you start doing the math. Yeah, that's a lot of people. That's 650,000 people already had the virus. But 650,000 people didn't go to the hospital, but they have antibodies. It is true that this test may be wrong. There's a lot of false positive, etc. So it can be either 40 something, or it could be 20, but it could be 60, it could be 50, who knows? Bottom line is that the prevalence of the virus is much higher than we thought it was. And this is a very big deal, because if that's the case, then if and when a second wave comes in, and assuming that you have the antibodies for at least 6 months, a year, which should be the case, if you get H1N1, you get 10 years of antibodies. So let's hope for the best. Let's pray that we get some antibodies for at least a little bit of time. Then that supports the valuations that we're seeing today in the US stock market, because it tells you that eventually, soon enough, people are going to figure out that if a lot of people already had this thing, it was because 97% of the people were asymptomatic. Really, that didn't make any sense. And the second issue is that probably you're getting close to some sort of herd immunity, because this virus mostly affects people with preconditions, very specific preconditions, heart disease, diabetes, and unfortunately, the elderly. So if you have a situation that most of the people that are at high risk either were already subject to or have already built immunity, because those people also had probably asymptomatic issues, then the second wave won't be that bad. So to me, that is the only possible explanation of why we are where we are. And if that's the case, that is beautiful news for a country like Brazil, irrespective of everything that Lisa, Ottaviano, Chris, and Alberto said, because those issues are the real thing. But Brazil is a high beta trade, and it's a damn cheap beta trade. At 505, the real is damn cheap. It's very cheap. It was cheaper at 570, but at 505, it's very cheap. How cheap is it? It's only about 10% cheaper than how it was right before Lula won, and we were talking about the default of C bonds. That's the reality. That's how cheap it is. So if we believe that we're going to have a good year, a good scenario in terms of the second wave, then people start looking at the BRL and start looking at the stock exchange, start looking at the banks, et cetera, because if this is the scenario we're going to live with, which is what so far the markets are signaling us we are going to have, then it makes sense to be overweight a country like Brazil, irrespective of all the problems that we have from a structural standpoint. And Renata, I don't know if you were able to get my presentation, or Sueli, I don't know if you have it. If you can project it, it's fine. If not, it's no big deal. But bottom line is, I didn't do this exercise. Our econometricians in Sao Paulo, very smart young kids that manage all the statistics models much better than I do. They did this exercise. They tested through with against one more, if you don't mind, down.
Oh, 1 second.
Sure.
Okay.
So this is the test they did from our model against Italy. It shows that it's pretty accurate in terms of getting the peak right. It's not that accurate in terms of getting the after the peak right, in terms of how many new cases you have, but still it was pretty accurate in terms of where we are right now. If we can, of how it was in the case of Italy. So what is it telling us against Brazil? That's the next slide, if you don't mind. So this is what it's telling us against Brazil. Basically, it's telling us that we're about 10 days away from the peak in terms of fatalities. That's what it's telling us. And to your right, the slide to your right, if you're looking at the computer, you see that dotted line next to the 60,000 number. That's the capacity of the total Brazilian ICU units. The yellow line is where we are right now, or the estimation that XP has of where we are right now. And the red line is the supposed, or what the model was in terms of a stress scenario of how you get to the maximum level. So we're to the right of that graph. And that's good news, because that means that we're having less people going to the ICU compared to the model, which has been relatively accurate in terms of looking at the fatalities. And the next one, if you don't mind, the next graph. The next graph is what my guys are projecting from the information that we have right now in terms of the utilization of ICUs going forward all the way until October. And as you can see, that's the gray line. We never get to the top. According to the models that we are running at this point in time. Why is this important for us, for me, as from a human standpoint? Because I think that the biggest tragedy of the COVID situation was what we saw in Italy and Spain, in which doctors had to make a choice on who would get treatment and who would not get treatment. To me, that's the biggest moral issue having to do with this disease, not the fact that we have a disease, that it is what it is, and we'll see how this thing disappears or not. But just from the standpoint of a country having to make a decision of choosing who gets and who doesn't get treatment, thank God, so far, things are looking like we will not have to go there, which is a good piece of information from the standpoint of the social well-being of Brazil. And I stop with that.
Thank you. Before I start asking my questions, I'll just remind you all that you can send questions on the Zoom group chat. You can either select it to everyone, and that will go to everyone, or you can send them to me, and I will pick a few and read here to our participants. I'll start with Alberto Ramos, and just what is your concern about, we weren't on full lockdown, but we were on some important states, especially Sao Paulo, in quarantine, a lot of things closed, and now we're beginning to open. And here in Brazil, the concern of a lot of experts has been that it's too soon to open because we haven't yet reached the peak, as Alberto was saying. What's your concern of that, us having to close it again, and what would the economic impact of that be?
I mean, the concern is the concern of everybody that, we don't have enough data, particularly in terms of testing and in the capacity to do tracing after that. We see those estimates that the team of Alberto Bernal put together. But the bottom line is that with very little testing, the degree of confidence in those estimates usually is not particularly high. But if those numbers are right, I think it's very hopeful. And if we have reached levels of immunity already that are quite significant, you can start to ease the lockdowns without a significant increase in the risk of a second wave of infections. I think The first one, to a certain extent, took a lot of people somewhat by surprise. You know, the violence and the speed at which the outbreak materialized and overwhelmed the healthcare system in Italy, in Spain, and other places, which was very unfortunate. I think from a personal standpoint, from a behavioral standpoint, you know, people are behaving in a completely different way. Even, you know, doesn't matter what is legislated or mandated by the local or the federal authorities, as long as individuals don't feel totally safe out, they won't. Right? You know, even if Sao Paulo is open for business, you know, most likely people will refrain from going to a movie theater, to a soccer stadium, to a crowded restaurant. So again, you know, there is an element of personal fear that conditions your behavior, will have an impact on activity. And I think that fear will only be significantly overcome once you either develop an effective treatment or a vaccine, right? You know, until that is in place, you can open, you can reopen. There is always the risk that, you know, because this is unique to a certain standpoint, we don't know the viral path. But I think the fact that this is going to be a gradual process, the fact that people will be more cautious than they were before, they will be washing their hands more, they will be wearing a mask to avoid crowded places. I think the risk of a second wave is somewhat limited, or at least much higher than seeing the peak that we saw before. If we are wrong and we have to reinstate the lockdowns, the impact of activity just double down. I would say it's almost linear. But don't discount human ingenuity. The capacity to generate GDP and to adapt to the current restrictions, you know, is quite significant. Even if you go back to the same lockdowns, you know, people will find smart business ways to generate activity and to satisfy demand given those restrictions, right? But let me allow, you know, just, you know, two quick comments, you know, one on Alberto, that what is the worst trade, being long real is the short real. I think it's funny, I think it's right, but that may also be a reflection of, you know, the history up to now was very high carry. You know, it was very difficult to be short the real when real interest rates were so high. With real interest rates approaching zero, that proposition, you know, may have softened a little bit at the margin. But I agree. I mean, it's super competitive, it's super cheap on any metric that you run. You know, being short the real, you have to make a conscious bet that, you know, things will careen out of control from now forward. And if we take at face value, and I think we should, what Chris was mentioning, the possibility of a grand bargain, you know, and that the leadership in Congress is well aware and, you know, that wants to keep some distance from a fiscal crisis. By the way, many of them are businessmen, so they have a vested interest in avoiding a fiscal crisis, and still the relatively fresh memory of what happened in 2014-15 is still a lesson that I think to some extent was incorporated. So let me share with all of you a little bit of an anecdote. When I was at the IMF, I was working with someone very, very senior that knew Brazil and Argentina and the Southern Hemisphere inside out. I think many of you, all of you know who I'm talking about. And as a young economist, he used to tell me, you know what is the problem with Brazil, Alberto? The problem with Brazil is coping with success. Every time things go well, somehow, you know, we find a way to screw up. We find a way to waste the opportunity. On the other hand, we are so good with dealing with crisis. Like, we are like no one who can manage a crisis. Every time you're facing the abyss, you approve a social security reform or something else, you step away from it, you know. So this may be in a situation where, you know, we are facing really nasty trade-offs where inaction can be very consequential, and therefore, you know, the probability of a grand bargain that the political class comes together and say, like, boys, we need, you know, boys and girls, you need to, you know, to do something about it. And enough procrastination. There are important fiscal bills. You know, there is nothing we can do at this stage because the fiscal debt is going to balloon. We're going to be much more vulnerable from a fiscal standpoint. The situation was fragile already. It's going to be even more fragile. So let's send the signal that we are re-anchoring the system from the medium term to the present. Let's do the administrative reform, the tax reform, and all the other bills. But my question is that enough? I think it is a necessary step, but in the end, we need to retrench spending. We're still spending too much. I'm not even talking about the efficiency of spending, right? We need to find a way to do a fiscal adjustment proper that is not just by repressing public investment. That's still a big challenge. And I'm not sure yet that the political equilibrium is there to validate that. I think Ottaviano wants to interject here.
Yes, but in fact, Alberto, I guess you said it all right. The way we see, I'm talking, remembering my times at the World Bank produced a public expenditure report for Brazil, the outcome of which is closely what the governments have been following. And they encompass reforms on the mandatory expenditure so as to open the space while keeping the spending cap for, let's say, more productive investments. And that's where the administrative reform, reducing the premium that the public sector employees have vis-a-vis the private sector fits in, as well as reviewing the plethora of tax exemptions that are there. But if I may, Julia, I need to correct, to be fair with respect to a statement that I made at the outset. Brazil has not, when I said that Brazil is not performing as well as it could with respect to COVID, I have much in mind the levels of Google Mobility Index that have shown clearly that Brazil is below the average, which means that the opportunity to reduce the infection rate may have been lost. And I also must be fair. The reality, for instance, in some states, take the state of Rio Grande do Sul in the southern part of Brazil, the performance has been exuberant. And why? Because the state apparatus has used planning, has used mapping incidence of COVID, has been using interdisciplinary, and by the way, I'm not supporter of the government, but it's the data showing how, for instance, the mortality, the state of Rio Grande do Sul has 56 cases of deaths per 100,000 inhabitants, compared to 720 per 100,000 in the Amazon state. So the Brazilian reality is heterogeneous, and it shows exactly how using science and data helps to get good results. And one final thing, Alberto, both Albertos have referred to the flows recently. Let's keep in mind the difference between the short term and the long term. It doesn't surprise me. I'm not a trader, but frankly, what has happened to the Rio, it doesn't surprise me, because obviously financial markets overshoot. The outflow in March was way beyond, let's say, whatever any fundamentals would say. And same here in the US as well, in the corporate debt markets and asset markets. So naturally, there is a bounce back. But we should look at the picture in the long term. And what concerns me is the following. Even before March, the outflows of portfolio capital, because as reflecting the unwinding of fixed income positions, has not been replaced by other types. And that's where the importance of the structural reforms will be in the future. The country, Brazil, is a low saving rate country. Capital inflows matter, but capital inflows will only take place if new outlets for capital take place, materialize. And that will be, so we'll not watch, let's say, a new landscape of money coming in before the country has acquired the credibility and starts with the investment projects in the future that we're referring to. So we should keep in mind, one thing is the trader perspective that looks at the last 2 weeks and so on, and the other one is the more structural issues that we are hammering on here.
I think that's the point, one of the points I wanted to highlight, that totally agree with Alberto about the fiscal measures, tackling spending, etc. But you're not going to solve the overall fiscal picture with just that, so to speak. You need growth, right? And so that's where the broader reform agenda that has been on and seems to still be, at least certainly being pushed by the economic team, certainly from when Chris is highlighting the awareness in Congress, that's going to be key too, is to kind of revert the hit to the trend growth in the coming years. That's the key.
You know, I would just kind of piggyback on that as well, and just Otaviano's and Alberto's comments and what Lisa just said is that when you look at, I think we're going to have kind of two stages here, right? I mean, the second half of the year is going to be really the politics of how we emerge out of COVID and what's the fiscal grand bargain, right? In terms of how much more one-off benefits do we get? How do we think about 2021? How do we deal with the cap on spending? I think some kind of grand bargain is likely. The quality of the bargain will depend upon how deeply polarized politics is, how weakened the president is, right? How desperate he is to fight for his mandate. So I think the devil rests in the details. And I take Alberto's point that it may not be enough. So that's I'm not an economist, but maybe the levels of debt are too high and the counterparty measure is not enough. And, so all I can give to you is that I've sensed this fear in Congress. I'm not sure if that's going to be enough or not. But anyway, we're going to have to wait to see the quality of that debate. The second is, I do think tax reform is coming on the docket. I mean, it's interesting. You have to think about if you're a legislator sitting in Congress and you're in a deep recession, what reform agenda is aligned with the politics of a recession? And I think that tax reform is seen as at least a proposal that can be seen as productivity enhancing, growth enhancing, right? I think the face of tax reform will change because we're in a deep recession. But I think some version of tax reform is likely to get done. There's a lot of momentum. The parties are already talking about re-engaging in negotiations now the next month or two. I don't think it gets done this year, but I think it'll be on the docket for next year. Final quick point in terms of, I think, Alberto Bernal's point, I think we can all talk about politics, investigations against the president, what the Supreme Court does, this or that. The big driver is what happens on COVID. I mean, it's just, if Alberto Bernal is right and we have an easier transition, well, that will shape the politics in a more favorable direction. If we have easing too soon, the pace of infection picks up, and we get closer to a public health collapse over the next 2 or 3 months, stop and go, differential, depending upon the region you're in the country, and the president gets blamed for it, that's a whole different scenario. So in other words, we got to keep our eye on the ball. And I think that the evolution of COVID is still the biggest known unknown on the scenario out there, politically as well.
Take a question that we got on the chat here, adding another potential unknown. Do you see the chance that Brazil, the protests that we're seeing in the US migrate to Brazil? Something similar happens in Brazil.
Yeah, real quick, absolutely, a version of that. I mean, I think we're headed towards, I'm not sure if it's a contagion in the sense of kind of racial injustices and equities translated to Brazil, but I do think we're going to have a deeply polarized environment where the anti-Bolsonaro folks are going to be more vocal, more hardened. They're likely to take to the streets, and you have a hardening of the Bolsonaro folks willing to defend the administration. So I don't think we're headed towards an environment like Chile, where we had last year, or Colombia, where we have a wave of protests against the government. I think it's going to be more of a pros and against, but versions of that I think is likely to occur. And ultimately, the 600 real Corona voucher helps some of the dampen some of the social repercussions in the near term, but we are headed towards a meaningful hit and a president that fights his way out of corners. And his instincts are to fight against the establishment. That's the way he got elected. That's the way he's governing, and he'll double down on polarizing rhetoric as he gets weakened. And I think that that'll probably lead to some version of protests on the streets. Yes.
If I may, Julia, just add on that. We have very high frequency data in the United States, much more than in Latam, et cetera. But the effect is the same. I mean, US GDP in the second quarter is going to fall somewhere in between 35-40% annualized. It's going to be the same in Brazil. It's going to be the same in Colombia, probably a couple percentage more or less. And the effect is the same, but with the difference is that the US safety net, it's stronger than the one we have in Colombia, Peru, Brazil, etc. So I would say that is something that increases the risk of having disturbances from the social side because people are hungry and businesses are closed, etc. Because, for example, just in my home country of Colombia, I don't think that people have realized yet the level of destruction that will be happening on the restaurant sector, which is a huge employer in Colombia. Why? Because restaurants are still closed. So some people think that you open and it's like in the US, which maybe half of the restaurants or 75% of the restaurants will open up. Why? Because they had the help from the government. In Colombia, that's not the case. So most restaurants are just not going to open because they're closed. And then people will realize that the high cost of unemployment at that point in time. So that's a risk. On the other side, when you have people that have been confined and have been going hungry, et cetera, and they're in the informal sector. Many of those people will be actually quite thankful that they can go back and try to make a living to feed their families. So just perhaps the focus will be different from the one that we're seeing in the U.S., which is racial justice and income inequality and stuff like that, and more like, Jesus, let me try to go get something so that my family can have something to eat. So I guess I'm seeing, and I'm struggling with with that question, because it's something that I ask myself every day, because from some side, it could be much worse, but from the side of the necessity to go back to some sort of normal activity because you need to eat, will reduce some of the possible negative repercussions from the pandemic on economic activity and social, and the performance of, or the risk of major social eruptions.
Surely, if you allow me just 1 minute, a quick comment on that, follow up. I totally agree with the characterization of Alberto. I think it's important also to understand the journey that led us to where we are today. The last time Latin America grew more than 2% was 7 years ago. Average real GDP growth was 0.7. So living standards have been declining for a long time. There's a generalized sense of dissatisfaction. The credibility of the institutions has been eroded. We live in an age of diminished expectations, and we saw how that flared up from a social standpoint in Chile, to a lower extent in Colombia. We saw large demonstrations in Brazil a few years ago. In Argentina, it seems to be a national sport, so every other Friday we see, this social demonstrations. So there was something of an ill feeling already developing, even before COVID, that the region was falling behind, unable to deliver growth rates that would be high enough, robust enough to change the social picture of it. And then comes COVID, and Alberto is right, high levels of informality, social safety nets, not particularly robust, even though in Brazil we actually spend a lot in terms of social spending. It could be a question of how well allocated that spending is. So yes, there is some risk of rupture, institutional rupture, that the social peace can be compromised, depending how deep we go and how long we stay there. I think it will be more a function of how far we fall, but how high you bounce after you get there. If this is a very sluggish recovery, we may be up for some social trouble driven by the performance of the economy, which will probably be perceived as a political failure to deliver, the right policies to allow the economy to recover.
Speaking of spending, how do municipal or Congress elections that are due in a few months, if they happen, how do they play into this, into decisions on spending?
Yeah, I can give a quick answer there. I mean, we have local elections scheduled for October. The more likely outcome is that Congress and the electoral courts will pump that probably till December. So give it a couple months more. Usually, when you have local elections, legislators tend to be focused on those bases. About a quarter of federal deputies run for mayor. In any one given legislature, that's a very large. The mayor position is a very important backbone to Brazil's political party structure. Ultimately, it does undermine the conversation a bit. When you focus, it makes kind of maybe an administrative reform, a deep administrative reform, a bit more difficult because you are looking at kind of local elections. I don't think it'll undermine the ability to have some version of the grand bargain that I talked about. If you're talking about introducing flexibility on the cap on spending for 2021, ideally, of course, punting on that, till the next round of elections would be ideal, but that's very unlikely to happen. I think we're going to have only a partial punt on the elections. So I think it diminishes a bit, but again, these are extraordinary times of acute crisis, and what we're seeing is that in these moments, I think Congress will be able to move. So the old concern is that you get your pens and stop working for like a month and a half, 2 months before the local elections. I don't think that we're going to be in that equilibrium entirely.
One more question. This was specifically for Lisa and Ottaviano. Citing Jerome Powell here, talking about how inflation is not a concern and there's no foreseeable issues in financing stimulus packages now or in the future. So the question is the fiscal responsibility textbook applicable for Brazil no longer valid here in the US, or is it just a matter of debt service cost and credibility?
I mean, clearly, I mean, I think the fiscal situation in Brazil is a key factor why its rating is as low as it is, right? There are other key supports, you know, and Alberto highlighted that in terms of if you look at composition of the debt, which has, you know, weakened on the margin over the past 5 years in terms of floating rate, fixed rate kind of a thing, but it's held by locals. You don't have, it's not in foreign currency. That's a key distinction from Argentina. Brazil has a currency. And I think that underpins, and the depth of its capital markets are a key strength, and that underpins the economy, the fiscal, gives it fiscal flexibility to the degree that it has some, et cetera. And the fact it doesn't have this broader external vulnerability as well that Argentina does, as an example, with, you know, that's why this rating is not in the B category, right? If you had these kind of fiscal numbers, this kind of growth story, if you had the kind of external weakness that you had, you know, decade ago, over 15 years ago, that's a different story. But and while I highlighted, I think we see important strengths in the monetary policy framework, we're not also talking the US, right? So you can't compare the debt burdens, which actually probably are going to be similar, okay? And the fiscal outturns are probably going to be not too dissimilar this year for both countries, but the ratings are dramatically different because of a host of other factors, including the Fed, including the reserve currency status, including the breadth and depth of the economy. You know, so you can't, the same framework highlight the fiscal weakness in Brazil. There's the key fiscal weakness in the US, but the other pieces of the rating puzzle, so to speak, generate very different ratings outcomes. Fiscal matters, okay? It's going to matter in both, okay? But you know, there's a little bit more space in the US, and there's some other strengths that help mitigate that fiscal vulnerability for Brazil versus a lower rating.
Right. If I may compliment Lisa, we have to take into account that incredibly, inflation rates in Brazil are running below 2%, the consumer price index. That's inadequate. And the central bank still has some monetary policy space to go. I'm pretty sure that everyone here who accompanies this is already forecasting the basic interest rate in Brazil to go down to 2.25% the next monetary policy committee meeting. That's almost a consensus. And allowing even the president of the central bank to say that, well, there's way to go before we need to use unconventional monetary instruments, for instance, which is now available there through the repo operations. Now the repo agreement, the central bank can innovate, can use that to support the debt financing of the treasury. So even though, of course, Brazil doesn't have a reserve currency status, has not the exorbitant privilege of the US, but roughly it sounds like 2020 is not a year in which the concerns with monetary policy space and funding come to the fore. It's all in the open when it comes to next year onward. And one can see this by still the slope of the yield curve in Brazil's yield curve. We can see that everything has been postponed to 2021 onward.